And I'll start by introducing them to you. Jeff Lux, I've known as the professor of landscape architecture for my son when he went to UC Davis. I knew him as our chief planner in the city of Davis. And now he has a fascinating job dealing with transit-oriented development as town manager in the city of Truckee. Dan Sperling, a hero of mine, he's been for 9 years on the California Resources Board, where I think of any entity, you've done more to address greenhouse gas emissions than anybody, including influence, at least for a time, what was happening at the federal level. So thank you. He's also director of Transportation Studies, Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, in a great class that he teaches, I understand. And Julie, I'm going to mispronounce your name, I just know, so would you say it for me? See? She's a professor and director of American Studies at UC Davis, and she's the founding director of the Environmental Justice Project for UC Davis, and I think that's one of the really tough nuts that we have had to tackle, and so I'm so glad that you were able to be on the panel too. So we're going to start with Jeff. You have 5 minutes, and we will warn you when your time's up.
Thank you. Is this on? Yep, appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having us this responding panel. It's very exciting for me to be back at UC Davis and think about these big, broad issues, because I'll tell you, as a town manager, I spent the last 2 days with my town council debating issues like whether we should have the big 6-foot-tall rusty ant sculptures in the middle of the roundabout or the big 12-foot-tall rusting musician sculptures in the middle of the roundabout. So it's nice to think big. So appreciate it. I'll just hit on a couple of points, one of which I think was just the overall notion of the Strategic Growth Council, which is bringing agencies together, which is phenomenal and hasn't happened at the state. Years ago, it did not happen often. It does now, and we appreciate it. And I think that same model works at all levels of government. So I'll give you one local example that we have going up in Truckee. There's a lot of JPAs, Joint Powers Authorities, and organizations like that. In Truckee, we have to do that because we have 18 special districts in addition to a town and 2 counties, and we have to kind of work together to get anything done. So we have a group called the Mountain Housing Council. They've been 3 years working now, 28 different agencies and organizations, private, public, all the agencies trying to work on housing issues regionally or semi-regionally. So I think the model that SGC brings is absolutely critical, absolutely necessary, and really the only way to get work done in this arena. And I'll just give you a Truckee example. In Truckee, we've been the very, very fortunate and grateful recipient of not one AHSC grant, not 2, but 2.5. And I'll explain that. We've got 2 $11 million grants for Truckee for large projects, mostly affordable housing near transit, although one of them is a large mixed-use development. And just give you a little flavor for that, $11 million, including about $20 million of both town and private subsidy, went into our rail yard master plan, and it essentially is going to double the size of the town's downtown. In a former brownfield site that was once a rail yard, then it was an old lumber mill, and then it sat vacant for 50 years. And now after 20 years of planning and working, we've got roads, we've got utilities, we've got bike paths, we've got development pads, and we have one 77-unit low-income affordable housing project off the ground. And it's pretty exciting, but it's pretty difficult. Implementation of these things takes a long time, takes a lot of people, and difficult. But we're really excited about what we call the Artists' Lofts, which is a 77-unit low-income project in that development. So anyway, we've been a fortunate recipient of all the great work that's done here. I will say that this kind of is obvious, but it really important, especially when the rubber hits the road, which is often at local government, that sticks and carrots do work, and they work from the state level. And I think here we have a carrot, a very nice one, which is a tremendous amount of dollars that come down to worthy projects, and it really breaks down those institutional barriers. And from my perspective right now, as a local institutionalist, I'm in an institution, those barriers can be significant and they can take years to break down, especially in small towns like ours. Truckee, by the way, is 16,000 people, so we're a very small, isolated Sierra town. And finally, I'll just end my comments with a general notion of project implementation, or even program and project implementation. It's one thing to set a policy, it's another to provide some dollars, it's yet another to craft criteria and put out RFPs and do all that stuff. It's very, very challenging to get things done. Not only do you have to have that political will and political alignment, which can be challenging even within the 5 people who operate a town, more or less 18 special districts, 2 counties in a town. The financing has to come together. Public and private have to work together. Dollars have to come in from multiple sources. Landowners have to get together. And all of that can be challenging to kind of hold on to. And I think this program that Louise is involved in is, incredibly good at breaking down some of those barriers and kind of making things happen. And finally, I'll just end by saying, it is pretty costly. That 77-unit low-income housing project talked about cost $37 million to produce. That's after the land costs $1. The remediation was done for free, essentially, from the point of view of the developer, and the $11 million of state money. Then it costs $37 million. So these are tough projects. We look at affordable housing and workforce housing as our, meaning Town of Truckee's, most important contribution to social equity and kind of economic equity and housing equity, because it's probably the best thing we can do. And we put a lot of energy into it.
Dan.
Thank you very much. So I'm part of the Mutual Admiration Society with Judy. And Judy, being with Jeff here on this panel, it inspired me to think about, this idea of sustainability and how we're changing things. And I think an insight that I'd like to offer is that the focus now, and this is where the Judy inspiration comes from, is much more so on local governments or local places than ever before. And, it fits with what Louise was talking about. She talked about place-based, talked about engagement, integrated, equity themes. And the focal point of all of those are increasingly at the local level to accomplish all the changes for sustainability we talked about. It used to be we were building big infrastructure. We had the big water systems and the big transportation systems, but we mostly built that. And now we're at the stage of having rebuilding, retrofitting, improving. And in many ways, that's much harder. Well, we're not very good at big infrastructure anymore, but that's another topic. But what's really difficult are these changes that we're talking about. So I focus on transportation. So I look at it, transportation is changing dramatically. So 10 years ago, really just 10 years ago, the options that we would be talking about, okay, we're going to put buses in, maybe we'll put a light rail line in, maybe we'll put a carpool lane in on the freeway. That was the extent of transportation planning and investment and thinking. Now, we've got a whole slew of new innovations and new changes, and all of it is just in the last 10 years, and in many ways, the last 3 or 4 years. We've got all these concepts like micro-transit. So Sacramento is making a big push in that, and it's really, think of Uber on steroids. It's like vans that have it could be in practice anywhere from 5 to 15 or 20 people, and it's demand responsive. So it especially works well in suburban areas where where buses and rail don't work very well. So this is a whole new innovation that is being implemented now. There's one company, VIA, that's really promoting it in particular, especially in the Sacramento area, but they're a global company. We got all these what we call micro-mobility technologies and services. You got scooters, you got dockless scooters, you got dockless bikes, and even the scooters are taking all kinds of form. They're just evolving now. There's scooters, the ones you think of that were more like kids, a kid's toy. That is, now they're putting bigger wheels on them, they're putting seats on them, 2 wheels in the front. So there's a lot of innovation happening there. And so, by the way, Davis, stop being so old-fashioned and stuck in the mud and thinking about all the bad things. Think about what it could be and should be. That was the Davis City Council I was talking to. So, we're seeing the opportunities for sustainability are just expanding so much, but so much of it is local now, because it's the local governments that have to make all this work. Again, another Davis example is pricing, curb pricing, parking pricing. It's like, okay, there's another one where I would reprimand the city council again. But it's so hard to make these changes to create, more sustainable transportation. And when I say sustainable, I mean it in all sense of it, in terms of equity, as well as economic and environmental. And so it's a message to local leaders, but it's also a local to researchers, how to think about working in helping local governments. And so a lot of it, so I go back to my transportation examples. You look at Lyft and Uber and this company Via, their success is going to depend on partnering with local governments. And it's in everyone's interest to do that and do it well, because conventional transit is just really expensive and serves very few people. And by the way, 5 years ago, I would never have said that in public because, first of all, it would be politically incorrect. But it was politically incorrect because there was no other good options available, especially to serve as a safety net and for equity purposes. Now we've got all these other options available. And so we do need to be thinking about new ideas, new ways of doing things. And the local governments need to think, okay, how do we partner? How do we work with the scooters? How do we partner with Uber? How do we partner with Lyft to really create much better services? And so, having said that, I'm a state regulator. I often introduce myself that way just to get people's hackles up, especially with the industry people. But there's still a very, very big role for state. It's like what Louise is doing with SGC, and what we're doing at CARB is we're creating these rules. I mean, I oversee the zero-emission vehicle program, the low-carbon fuels, the so-called SB 375, the communities program to try to reduce VMT in metropolitan areas. We have cap and trade. We have so many things that we're doing. And a lot of it has to do with funding as well. And that, in many ways, I think that's probably the biggest role here for how we think about the local and state working together. The state needs to fix some of its funding formulas, fix its incentive programs. Everything is so stovepiped. And we don't do we human beings, we people that are parts of institutions, that's our natural proclivity, to be stovepiped. And so breaking that down is really hard. Just figuring out how to serve local people, provide better transportation, better accessibility, get Uber or Lyft to work with local governments. I mean, where's money is needed, for that? Where does it come from? And there's no funding formula set up to do that. So, it discourages it. So, there's so much to do here. This is exciting. It's great that we have this workshop, focusing on sustainable cities. And I think focus on cities because that is, in my world, where the rubber meets the road. So thanks very much.
Dan. Julie?
Thank you for the invite. Nobody really wants to be after Dan and Jeff and Louise. And I'll just be honest that, I wasn't sure why I was invited, but since Bryan and Suad asked me to, I said, sure, I guess I'll come. No, to be honest, I probably was invited because I've done some work that looks at an eco-city in China that I'm pretty I'm pretty skeptical of. And so I come to a lot of the issues that we're talking about today from a place of an environmental justice critique. But I have studied sort of how top-down and bottom-up kind of meet and fight. Most recently, I edited a book called Sustainability Approaches to Social Power and Environmental Justice, which argues that sustainability without social justice is not sustainability. That seems, sometimes an important argument to make. It doesn't sound like it's an issue in SGC and in some places. But in others, that is an important thing to say. And it has a lot of empirical case studies where thinking about sustainability, thinking about environmental justice and sort of radical interdisciplinarity makes sustainability stronger. That said, I do come from this work as somebody who's worked on with environmental justice movements, both in New York and in California for over 25 years. And so this question, I want to get back to Elisa's point about the darkness and the light. And so the most recent book that I wrote that just came out this month is called Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. And it focuses on that question of hope in what is, incredibly bleak times if you care about not just environmental issues, but all kinds of issues. And so how do we retain, as Gramsci said, a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will? And so this, I think, day is a chance to reflect upon that. And I think, what I'll just try to close up with is to take in the social movement kind of sensibility into the work that we all do wherever that is, whatever institutional location that takes place. And so that said, I want to say that I've learned a ton. I learned a lot about from Louise's presentation, and I really appreciate the 4 principles and values of the coalition. And to just sort of plug in, maybe there are places where it can be taken even a little bit further. And I really appreciated, of course, the focus on race, and I was pleased to hear about the displacement avoidance plan and the focus on place. And I was going to say, well, there should be an explicit focus on race, which is difficult in a post-2009 environment. But I was surprised, but also happy to hear that those issues of place do intersect strongly with race and class. And so to continue to push that, whether explicitly or maybe it can't be as explicit, but of course in California, place is tightly bound to race and class. And second, the question of engagement, of course, everybody knows this, but it's worth saying, there are different kinds of engagement. There are different levels, and there are different types of collaboration. And so, you can have engagement that there's a whole spectrum of what that looks like. And the third is that this question of integration, of course, is important. I would say, in addition to thinking of integration as a 1 + 1 = 2 model, we could think about radical collaboration, radical getting rid of those boundaries itself. So rather thinking of this plus this plus this, to think in terms of crossing not just jurisdictional bureaucratic boundaries, but really crossing boundaries in really different ways as well. And that gets me to the last point about equity. I think that there was a discussion in the report on some of the breakouts about the attention on scale, and of course scale is a question of place, but it's also a question of time. And concerns about climate change have everything to do with time, and this question of the future and how much time we have and how do we get back to 1990 level emissions and so on. But I also want to, from a social movement standpoint, say that what environmental justice and racial justice activists always focus on is the axes of time in terms of things that we don't talk about in a policy framework, but things like settlement and displacement, not just the gentrification displacement, but in terms of native populations or issues of really strong the temporality of injustice in California, which still plays itself out in the current moment, and as we start thinking in a policy way of planning for the future. And so these are, maybe two academic terms, but I actually think that social movements and environmental justice activists are always thinking about the four categories that Louise laid out, but also slightly in different ways. And so that we can hold these things together, and maybe not always in a sort of policy easy way, but that it's important as people who possibly are in positions to impact what decisions get made, to kind of hold that in as these kind of projects move forward. And so this question of how policies, how movements interact into law and become policy imperatives, and how that impacts money and how that flows, all of that matters. But I think it's important to always retain that question of the questions of history and the questions of justice that environmental justice advocates have been pushing both in California and in many places right now. But and so that's, again, the hope, I think, is that even though things are really dark, because things are so bad, there's more of an opening for things that, in a different terrain, people wouldn't even consider. So I think that's, that we always have to hold those things as we do our work. So I'll just end there. Thank you.
Julie, what is the name of your book?
Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger.
Say that one more time.
Oh, it's called Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. And actually,
Wow.
the proceeds of the book go to two community environmental justice groups that I work with, one in the Central Valley, one in New York. And so it's looking at conflicts like Standing Rock and Flint, and there's a Central Valley chapter, Hurricane Maria. But it's also talking about the movements on the ground and how, there's work, to be done, and there's things to learn from movements that struggle. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I wasn't going to say anything, but this is inspiring me because I do believe in change at the local level, and that's what I've been working on for a long time. And as students, people in the audience who are learning all this stuff have an amazing role to play in a time of fear. And I graduated from UC Davis in the ecology graduate group in the middle 70s, and we were hearing things that scared us to death. Crazy things like you're going to run out of oil in 30 years, I wish. But we thought, we're not going to go on for a doctorate. We're going to quit with a master's, and we're going to fix things in our own community. So we got together, and we put together a plan, along with some residents in the community as well. And we ran one of our members who had been a president of the student body for city council. At the last minute, two other university-affiliated people joined, and we took over the city, and we implemented the plan, and it's there today. Bike paths, the community gardens, the green belt around the city. And that was students that we just got worried, and we stepped up and did it ourselves. And the other lesson that I've learned, and Kate Meese is continuing this work, that elected officials are elected, maybe you're a city employee, maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're a dentist, you don't know all of this stuff. And really, there's this incredible role for citizens to come in and help your elected officials make good decisions, and they're generally going to be pretty open to it, especially if you have a little larger group. So I continue to think that the university students can make a huge change in this city, in this time of crisis, and I invite you all to do it.